February is when most people are still planting their garden, while you could be planting the crops that will triple your harvest and carry your family through next winter. The difference between planting now and waiting until spring isn't about a few extra tomatoes. It's about having 200 pounds of potatoes stored in your cellar instead of buying them at $2 per pound all year. It's about eating fresh greens in April while your neighbors are still buying lettuce at $1 for a head. This is the victory garden method that fed millions of families during the war years, and it works because it uses February as the foundation month that makes abundance possible. Here's exactly what to plant right now before it's too late. The fundamental mistake that keeps most gardens producing for only 3 months of the year is treating February as a dead month instead of recognizing it as the single most important planting window that determines whether you lines have food security or dependence on grocery stores. Because the crops you start in February aren't just the early harvest. They're the foundation crops that store through winter, the succession plantings that fill the hungry gap, and the perennials that will feed you for the next 20 years. And every day you wait in February is production you lines never recover because time is the one thing you cannot manufacture in a garden. The Victory Garden movement understood this completely. During World War II, when 20 million American families were growing 40% of the nation's vegetables in backyard plots, they weren't planting everything in May like modern gardeners do. They were starting in February with the crops that would maximize yields and storage potential. They were thinking about calories per square foot and nutrition through winter, not just fresh tomatoes in August. And they succeeded because they followed a system that treated February as the month that multiplies food supply rather than wastes it. Here's what that system looks like in practice. February is when you plant early potatoes that will be ready to harvest in June, giving you new potatoes months before main crop varieties and allowing you to use that same ground for a second crop of beans or brassicas that will produce through fall. You're not just getting one harvest, you're getting 2 or 3 from the same space by starting early enough that the growing season becomes a production cycle instead of a single event. Plant seed potatoes in February under cloches or in a greenhouse, and by midsummer you lines have harvested 50 pounds of early potatoes and replanted that bed with fall cabbage that will store until spring. February is when you direct sow broad beans outside in mild climates or under protection in colder areas, and these beans will be producing in May. And June when nothing else is ready yet, filling the hungry gap that leaves most gardeners buying vegetables for months after winter storage runs out. And broad beans aren't just early food. They're nitrogen fixers that improve your soil while they grow, leaving behind root nodules packed with nitrogen that will feed the next crop you plant in that space. This is how you build fertility while you produce food, turning every crop into a soil improvement project that makes next year's garden more productive than this year's. February is when you start onions from seed indoors if you want bulbs large enough to store through next winter, because onions started in February will grow for 7 months before harvest, developing the size and density. That makes them keep for 8 to 10 months in proper storage. While gardeners who plant onion sets in April will get small bulbs that rot by December, your February started onions will be feeding your family until the following summer when the next crop is ready. This is the difference between self-sufficiency and dependence. This is what Victory Gardens understood that modern gardening has forgotten. February is when you transplant out overwintered onion seedlings that were started in fall, spacing them 6 inches apart in rich soil, where they lines bulb up through spring and early summer to give you the earliest onion harvest possible. And these overwintered onions won't store as long as spring-sown ones, but they lines bridge the gap between when your stored onions from last year run out, and when this year's main crop is ready, ensuring you never have to buy onions from a store. This is succession planning. This is thinking in systems rather than single plantings. February is when you sow leeks indoors in seed trays, and these leeks will grow thick as your wrist by fall and will stand in the garden through the entire winter, unaffected by frost and snow, providing fresh vegetables in January and February when almost nothing else is available. 100-leek plants started in February will give you to per week for an entire year, and they cost pennies to grow compared to the $3 each they sell for in stores during winter. This is how you eat well while everyone else is surviving on storage crops and grocery store vegetables that have been shipped thousands of miles. February is when you plant shallots outside, pushing the individual bulbs into prepared soil so just the tips are showing. And each bulb you plant will multiply into 8 to 12 bulbs by summer harvest, giving you a return of 800 to 1200% on every shallot you put in the ground. And shallots store even better than onions, often keeping for 14 months in cool, dry conditions, which means a single February planting will feed you until the following spring when the cycle begins again. This is food security. This is what it looks like to not depend on industrial agriculture. February is when you start celery indoors in seed trays, because celery needs a 16-week growing season and won't tolerate being transplanted late or checked in its growth. And while celery has a reputation for being difficult, the real secret is simply starting it early enough that it has time to develop properly without stress. Celery started in February and transplanted out in May will be ready to harvest through fall, and can be earthed up or moved to a trench for blanching, giving you sweet, crisp stalks that bear no resemblance to the bitter, stringy celery most gardeners produce from late starts. This is why timing matters more than technique. February is when you sow early cabbage indoors for transplanting in April, and these cabbages will be ready to harvest in June and July, filling the gap between spring greens and fall storage crops. And early cabbage isn't just about fresh coleslaw in summer. It is about having food producing in your garden during the months when most people's plots are still developing, giving you abundance while others are waiting. Plant 6 to 8 cabbage transplants in February, and you'll have 40 to 60 pounds of cabbage in midsummer. Enough for fresh eating, fermenting into sauerkraut, and sharing with neighbors who will wonder how you're harvesting when their gardens are barely flowering. February is when you start cauliflower indoors, and cauliflower is the crop that exposes whether you understand succession planting or not, because cauliflower must never stop growing from seed to harvest, or it will form premature buttons instead of large curds. Started in February, transplant it carefully without disturbing the roots. Keep it growing with consistent water and fertility, and you'll harvest heads the size of dinner plates in early summer. But start it late or let it get checked, and you'll get nothing but disappointment. This is why February matters. February is when you chit seed potatoes by placing them in shallow trays in a bright, cool location where they'll develop short, sturdy sprouts over 6 to 8 weeks. And chitted potatoes planted in March or April will emerge faster, grow more vigorously, and yield more heavily than unchitted ones, giving you an extra 20 to 30% production from the same amount of seed and space. This is the difference between 200 pounds of potatoes from 100 square feet and 300 pounds from the same area. This is how Victory Gardens maximized production when every square foot had to count. February is when you force rhubarb by covering established crowns with barrels or large pots and piling manure mixed with straw over them, and the heat from the decomposing manure combined with darkness will force tender, sweet stalks weeks before unforced plants produce. And while forcing weakens the plant, so you can't do it every year. Alternating between crowns means you can have forced rhubarb every February without damaging your overall production. This is fresh fruit in late winter when nothing else is available, and it's the kind of intensive production technique that separates serious growers from hobbyists. February is when you plant asparagus crowns in prepared trenches, and while you won't harvest for 2 years, that single February's work will give you fresh asparagus every spring for the next 20 years with minimal maintenance. An asparagus bed planted this February will produce 50 to 100 pounds of spears per year once established, and at $10 per pound in stores, that's $500 to $1,000 worth of food annually from 1 day's planting work. This is how you build permanent food security. This is investment in future abundance. February is when you sow parsnips directly in the ground, because parsnips need a long growing season and must be sown early while the soil is still cold to trigger germination. And parsnips are the sweetest after frost, which means February sown parsnips will be ready to harvest from November through March, providing fresh root vegetables through the entire winter. A 20-foot row of parsnips sown in February will yield 60 to 80 pounds of roots that store in the ground better than any root cellar could preserve them, staying fresh and crisp until you dig them. February is when you start tomatoes indoors if you have a greenhouse or polytunnel, where they can be planted early because tomatoes started in February and moved to protected growing space in April will be fruiting in June instead of August, giving you 3 months of additional production and turning a summer crop into a crop that produces from early summer through fall. This is 200 pounds of tomatoes from 20 plants instead of 80 pounds. And it's the difference between eating fresh tomatoes for 5 months versus 2 months. February is when you sow early peas outside under cloche or in cold frames, and these peas will be producing in May when peas sown in March are just flowering, giving you the earliest harvest of the sweetest vegetable in the garden. And after you harvest the peas in June, you can plant beans or brassicas in that same space for a fall crop, doubling your production from every square foot by using time as a multiplier rather than a constraint. February is when you plant fruit trees and berry bushes while they're still dormant, and getting them in the ground early means they'll establish before spring growth begins, giving them a full season to develop roots before they have to support leaves and fruit. A fruit tree planted in February will grow twice as much in its first year as one planted in April, and that head start compounds over the decades, turning a February planting into a tree that produces years earlier than a late planted one. February is when you prepare beds for spring planting by spreading compost and manure while the ground is workable, but not actively growing crops, and this prep work means that when March and April arrive, you're planting into rich, ready soil instead of scrambling to prepare ground while seeds wait. This is how you stay ahead of the season instead of chasing it. The transformation from a garden that produces for 3 months to one that produces year-round abundance begins in February when you recognize that this month isn't about waiting. It's about multiplying future harvests through early starts, long-season crops, and perennial plantings that will feed you for decades. The Victory Garden method works because it understands that February is when food security is built, not when it's planned. Every crop you start in February is food you won't have to buy later, storage you'll rely on next winter, and production that proves you can feed yourself without depending on systems you don't control. This is what real self-sufficiency looks like, and it starts right now while everyone else is still waiting for spring.